Welcome back to Doomsday Happy Hour. I'm your host, EJ Peters. And this is kind of a bit of a tribute to my parents. My dad used to say, "Can you go run and get me whatever? Because, you've got younger legs than me." Now, he was 33 when he became a dad. I was that when I met my husband. And needless to say, I was older than that when I became a mom for the first and second time over. So I guess it's a good thing that, my old legs that have to run and get stuff, well, we live in a one-floor apartment, so no steps to climb.
We interrupt this message to bring you a special announcement.
Once again, I'm in my bedroom, in the corner, hiding from my son, because while we found our blue ambulance,
I want a blue postcard.
we now can't find our blue sports car.
I want a blue postcard. I want a blue postcard.
By the way, we also happen to be missing another blue toy, a blue ball. So people, anybody who's watching this, please help. Just send us a bunch of blue toys. Now, when I sometimes ask my toddler, who's not yet 3, if he can run and go get me something, he says no. But at least he's polite about it. He says, "No thanks." Meanwhile, the now 18-month-old will run and get him, the 3-year-old, not even 3-year-old, whose legs apparently are older and can't be used to go get stuff. She'll bring him his blankie. Awesome. Anyway, it just goes to prove the point that my mom always used to say, "I hope you have a kid just like yourself," because I was so stubborn. Well, I also used to remind her that she was basically a dinosaur. By the time my kids are old enough to talk about dinosaurs, I will be so much older than she was when I, as like a 15-year-old, pointed out how old she had finally become. And, I used to joke about how her hair was going gray, but it wasn't really gray, it was silver, so she could pluck out the strands and, melt them down and sell them for money. There's a lot of money to be made here. Anyway, what goes around comes around. Comes back to bite you in the ass. So, Courtney Merklinger, thank you for joining me on Doomsday Happy Hour. Really glad you could join us.
Yes, I am too. Thank you so much for having me.
So before season 2 started, a couple weeks ago, I gave a little bit of a sneak peek and I mentioned that I was going to be interviewing somebody who had left the workforce for multiple years and then re-entered it. And that's not 100% accurate because, as I understand it, what actually happened was you had a long background in technology sales, and then you had a friend who you found online was working as a stylist at a company, Macadamia, and you said, "I'm more stylish than she is. I should be a stylist." And so you actually had 2 jobs at one point, your day job in technology sales, and then a part-time job at Macadamia. And then you had 1 child, and then I believe under 12 months old, and you were expecting a second. And ultimately, you decided to take a step back from technology sales, and you moved to focus basically full-time on being a stylist. And Macadamia, it grew by leaps and bounds. You became a senior stylist and a manager there. And then after several years there, then all of a sudden, you're no longer a stylist because there's no more Macadamia.
Sadly, no.
Right. So you pivoted back to technology sales, which is not the same thing as returning to the workforce after a complete absence, just staying at home completely.
Right.
But if I'm not mistaken, when you went back to interview for technology sales jobs, people treated it as if you'd basically been out of the workforce completely. Either it was like a hobby on the side, or they're like, "Well, yeah, you had 2 more kids. Of course you had to take time off." So it was like, right. For them, it was a blip.
Absolutely. And 100% accurate on everything you just said. The recap was phenomenal there. That is probably something that I found to be really interesting, because I think when I, sort of felt like, wow, Macadamia abruptly went out of business. And again, unfortunately, it was such an amazing job. I felt like, wow, I can't do nothing. And by saying that, I am certainly, not saying that being home with children full time is nothing, because it's
no, not at all, right?
It's it's extremely difficult job, and yes, rewarding, but very difficult. But I had always liked to sort of have some kind of income on my own coming in. So for me, it almost felt like, wow, this abruptly hit me in the face, and I didn't want to not have something else where I was able to contribute to my family. So I absolutely thought that by, starting to take these interviews and by having, trying to get back into technology sales, that they would say, oh, wow, so you were a stylist. You were actually with this company for, over 4 years. And, you were doing something there. You progressed to a manager and, you were never not working. But it really, like you said, it really wasn't taken like that. It was like, okay, well, you were off for a few years with kids, but that's not that big of a deal. Not a ton has changed. And you have such an extensive background as it is. So in a way, I found it easier to get back into technology sales than I had anticipated. But I also found the perception of what I had been doing for the past few years to be not as well received as I had originally thought it would be.
And did you try, and it sounds like, now I should say one thing, you're in Massachusetts, I think the Boston area, I'm in New York City, and my better half has spent a lot of time in Boston. And we kind of feel like technology, biotech, and education are kind of the industries there. Here, it's, a lot of Wall Street, lawyers, and, kind of really go, very profit centered. And so I feel like here, there's not necessarily the same level of just kind of facilitating other people sliding back into things. It sounds like people tried to make it as easy as possible for you, again, to slide back into technology sales, just as you said. But did you also frame it for them in a way so they understood that Macadamia was part of an overall trajectory that basically focused on sales?
Yeah, no, and you're absolutely right about Boston. And I will say Boston obviously Boston's a huge major city, but it's a lot smaller than New York. And so I think that I was also fortunate enough to have a very large network here. I just think in general, the technology sales industry in and around the Boston and the greater Boston area is smaller. And yeah, absolutely. I think that when I was, first starting to talk to a recruiter, and then when I started interviewing for the company that I'm no longer with now, but I was with for about 5 months. And it was a great place for me to kind of do this whole reentry into the workforce. But I absolutely said, hey, listen, you see here on my resume, I wasn't off. I was always working. And by always working, I mean, I always had something other than being home with my kids. And again, not trying to, to downgrade.
Exactly. No. We all agree that taking care of your kids is a full-time job, but that's why some of us who do non-childcare work with regards to our own kids, we have to get help to do that.
Absolutely. I think that once I started to explain, hey, granted, this was a little bit of a different job. I mean, now everyone's working from home, but when I started at Macadamia, the whole pretense was to give people who wanted to be home with their kids a place where they could still contribute to their families, and you could work as much or as little as you wanted. I went into that thinking, well, I don't know what all these other women's, what their backgrounds were, but mine has always been sales, and I've been in very cutthroat competitive sales organizations where I am not a cutthroat competitive person to the extent where I would knock someone else down or throw someone else under the bus. But I also understand that world a little bit where I know, oh, well, if I'm going to work just a little bit harder and I get more customers, I'm going to get ahead. So yeah, I absolutely explained to the technology folks that I was interviewing with that, hey, well, this was a little bit of a different job and I'm selling kids clothes. I was also selling a, potentially $20,000 worth of kids clothes in a month. And then I started to manage a team remotely. It was interesting that I think they started to take it a little bit more seriously once I was able to say, hey, listen, I was home, I was with some very young kids, and I was also getting up really early, working during the day when I could fit that in, when I wasn't with my kids, between naps, picking up, doing other things around the house, and working at night after everyone went to bed.
And that you had results to show for it, because I know sales is a bottom line business.
Yes, absolutely.
I remember you mentioning that your boss's boss at the software company you were at before becoming a full-time stylist at Macadamia was somebody you had known before, and that he was great. You worked with him at least one prior company, so he knew you and your work well, even though you never reported into him directly. And then
you mentioned that, he was a father of three. And so just after you left the company, he left. And he tried to recruit you to his new company in tech sales, at this time when you're, focusing full-time on Mac and Mia. And he tried to be supportive of you from that, corporate perspective, because he understood what it was like to be a parent of three, even though presumably, I'm guessing, just statistically, the odds are very high that he was not the primary caregiver for those kids on top of doing his, full-time job.
Yeah.
And, obviously your situation was different, obviously, between you and your husband, even though you're both in tech sales, you were the primary caregiving parent among the two of you. But that also brings me to your husband. So, you mentioned that he works, 12-hour days. And when you were at Mac and Mia, again, you were ultimately this senior stylist, this manager. You sometimes traveled for work. And so while juggling all of this, he also stepped in for you with regards to the kids. And I think you even told me that at one point, I think this was when you were a parent of one, his boss's wife actually watched your oldest daughter for a bit. And so what I'm gathering from that is a lot of times women, and specifically women who are mothers and who are trying to juggle work and family, they think that only another woman will understand. But here you have a supportive boss or boss's boss and a very supportive husband. And it seems like the support can come from all different angles. And are there kind of, when you're interviewing, if you're interviewing for a new place and you want to make sure that you're landing in a supportive environment that's going to allow you to thrive in both areas, are there kind of signals that you think you can pick up to say this is going to be somebody who's going to truly understand?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, you were 100% correct on a previous boss that I worked with at two other companies. He had three kids, and at the time I had just had one, so definitely did not understand what three kids was like. Much like my husband and much like many men, they are not necessarily the primary caregivers. My husband also does happen to be extremely supportive and is my biggest champion. But no, I do think that you can pick up on signals. I think when I was interviewing for the company that I was at previously, there was another manager that I had started interviewing with. I knew him. We sort of overlapped again at a company I worked for years and years ago, the first place that I was working when I was in technology sales.
Right.
And so he also had three kids. I didn't know him nearly as well. We just had, some mutual connections, but I didn't know him. But he was very supportive about it. He said, listen, I can't guarantee that you're going to be able to work from home. He said, but you come in, you prove yourself, and then we'll kind of see what happens. And he said, I understand you've got three young kids. Your husband is traveling, and that's a lot. Under him, there was a separate manager that I interviewed with who had one child. He gushed over his wife and his son. And to me, I took that as a very, very positive sign. That I definitely think you have to get that feeling that the people that you're going to work for, men, women, whatever the case may be, that they are going to know that you do have a life outside of work. And, women, just because you're working for another woman, she may not understand that. Not every woman is, supportive of that either. So,
that reminds me of my time in recruiting when I had one candidate, it was actually a man. He and his wife were expecting, and he announced to a woman who had, I think, 3 kids, at least 2, and who I think was, at 80%, but was more senior than him. He announced that, he was expecting, and she was actually upset.
Really?
Because it was she knew that, once he had an additional focus, something else, he wouldn't be available 24/7.
Right.
And so I think there is kind of the stereotype that women are always more understanding. That's not always the case. So it really, I think, helps us to identify who are the people and what are the signals that we can pick up on from these people that are going to identify whether man or woman they're going to be supportive or not.
Yeah, no, when I was at a previous company as well, I actually worked directly for a woman who I didn't feel was that supportive. And I don't know if some of that, and she actually happened to have kids. She had 2 kids. She was I don't know how much older than me, let's say 15 to 20 years. But her kids were a little bit older at the time, but she was absolutely not as supportive as you would have thought. Got me some very lovely gifts when I had my first daughter,
you mentioned.
which was very, very generous. And I very much appreciate that. But, you know, I'd rather have your support than have
I agree,
high-end gift for my child.
110%, 1,000%.
Not that I don't like high-end kids clothes. That's not, you know, I'm not going to lie about that.
So now, as a mom of three, ages 6, 4.5, and almost 2, what are some of your top tips for balancing work and family? And part of the reason I'm asking this is because before I was a recruiter, I was a lawyer, very briefly for like 1 minute. But as a part of that, I went to law school. And at law school, they had a women's law association. And I went to one thing, and they had 2 partners and 2 associates who were moms and who were part-time. And the one common theme that they all said was that to succeed at their jobs, they had to have full-time help, because even though they're all part-time, sometimes there are weeks when they were going to do their normal 60 or 80%. And other times there were weeks when they were going to do 100, 120%, but they all said that they wouldn't be able to respond to the firm's needs if they didn't have full-time help, and that the people they saw if you're going to call it a sink or swim system, the people they saw sinking were the people who had part-time help, who relied on it being like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, or Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and then suddenly they needed to work Tuesday and Thursday in addition, and they couldn't find childcare coverage. And so, you know, basically they were doing at that time what everybody's doing now COVID-wise, you know, juggling work and family, and there was no leeway because nobody else was going through this with them.
Yeah, exactly.
So what are your top tips?
I would say that's probably number one. That's huge. And not only to have full-time help, but to have full-time help that you can rely on. Childcare and all of that aside, I will say the one thing that I find to be the most helpful is to be organized. Not only with your job, of course, but with, you know, what are your kids going to need for the next day? I'm planning the week on Sunday and making sure that I know, all right, we've got to do this for school or that for school, or we have this activity and they're going to need these outfits laid out. And so just making sure that you know the schedule, where everyone has to be, who's going to be bringing them, what clothes they're going to need to wear. So I would say my number one thing is just to be as organized as you possibly can.
Got it. My last question for you is, when you were plotting your path back into technology sales, because it sounds like you were pretty strategic about how you did it. It sounds like you networked a lot. And even though you maybe didn't need to, because people were making it such a smooth landing for you as you kind of slid back into things, you did kind of strategize about how to craft the narrative that Macadamia, while it was outside the normal framework, stepping outside the normal framework, it was still sales, and a lot of the skill set that you use there was the same skill set that you use in sales in any area. But so you were being very strategic. And when you were going back into the technology sales workforce, I should say, instead of just the overall workforce, you decided to take a bit of a step back compared to where you had been before Macadamia. Can you tell us what you were thinking and kind of what the short-term goal was?
So the first job that I had, that I was only at for a few months, that was actually right in my wheelhouse of what I had done before, right in terms with compensation and all of that. But it was the job that I'm at now, where I'm not what you would call the actual closing sales rep right now. So I'm sort of the lead generation person. And in other aspects of my career, I've had a lead generation.
Say that again. You were
lead generation, business development, if you will. There's so many different terms for it. So I'm the one that is qualifying opportunities, finding out if in fact this is worth it to send to the counterparts. And actually on my team, they're both women, which is awesome. At the company I'm in, and we sell robots, which is very cool to think of.
Yes.
Selling robots. There's plenty of amazingly caring, wonderful, smart men at this company too. But I'm in the retail vertical, which is sort of right up my, so I'm happy I'm in a retail vertical, but I'm selling robots. That's very new to me, very, very
Right.
different, out of my wheelhouse. So a couple things, I didn't have the experience to come into this company and say, oh, I'm going to be the closing sales rep and sell robots to your warehouse, because that wasn't my background. I didn't have a background in supply chain and warehousing and all of that. This is all new to me. The women who are on my team, who are the closers, if you will, have that background. And they're amazing at what they do. So yeah, I did take a little bit of a step back in terms of not only a role, but also pay. But
It was
I'm buying
so
those.
kind of with the view to getting retrained, though, is what you're saying almost, like, or trained in a parallel way.
Yes, exactly. And the company it's a much smaller company than I've ever been used to, besides Mac and Mia, but that was sort of a totally different ballgame. But it's a smaller company, but growing very quickly. So there's going to be a lot of opportunity to maybe do some different things here. But yeah, I think, the way we looked at it was, I'm going to be trained in this area. How soon I'm going to move up? Again, I'm unsure because my kids are still really young.
Basically, what you're saying is it's one step back to take 2 to 3 steps forward, ultimately.
Yeah, and I don't know when that's going to be, but right now it's working really well for our family. And as I said, I'm still able to contribute, which is important for me, and still be able to see my kids a lot. And in the past 6 months, a lot more than
Arguably too much.
yeah. Some days it's too much. So.
Courtney, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me. This was great.